Silicon Valley has to a conscience by The Atlantic. After having been the design ethicist at Google, he's now created the Center for Humane Technology, co-created it, and he's going to talk a lot about his values, what he's discovering, what he would like to see happen. But even more exciting, it's not just Tristan, it's Tristan with Casey Newton, who anybody who follows anything about social media, if you don't get Casey Newton's email, you are out of the loop at this point. Within a very short time, he has established himself as the authoritative journalist on what's happening with social media, and so I'm very pleased that Casey will be interviewing Tristan, and they'll have a conversation. So Tristan and Casey, come on out.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and hello, Tristan.
Hey.
We're excited for this session. If you're looking at your phone or computer during this session, just know that you're making Tristan's point for him. You have prepared something for us to look at to kind of set the terms of the discussion.
Set the tone, yeah. So I just wanted to walk through, there's so many different problems in technology, addiction, polarization, fake news, election integrity. I thought we could set the stage about why so many things seem to be going wrong at once. So just some quick slides, and these are auto-playing. The real problem of humanity, as E.O. Wilson said, is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. We're chimpanzees with nukes, and these Paleolithic emotions are the ancient part. So when I was a kid, I was a magician. They're all about hacking your Paleolithic emotions. While we are all looking out for the moment when technology overwhelmed our strengths, it went over us, we missed a much earlier point when technology went underneath our weaknesses. And when technology overwhelms human weaknesses, that's what a magician does. Let's walk through what happens. So when it overwhelmed our cognitive limits, we feel that as information overload. When it overwhelmed our dopamine, we feel that as addiction, compulsive use. When it overwhelms our social validation, that self-image approval, we feel that as mass narcissism, confirmation bias and fake news, outrage and polarization. And when it overwhelms our trust, you get bots and deepfakes. If you then look at the second order consequences, information overload leads to shortening attention spans, social isolation, teen depression, suicide, breakdown of truth-making, and post-truth world. So this together is a connected system of harms, not one problem, that is what we call human downgrading. It's the climate change of culture. Sorry, these slides are going fast because it's on autoplay. And this is critical because, I think I know what's coming next, the complexity of our critical problems and our global challenges is only growing, right? The complexity of climate change, complexity of inequality, what should we do? The human capacity to respond is tapping out. So the biggest problem is that our biggest problems are exceeding our capacity to solve them, right? And human downgrading is existential because it does that, right? It's never been harder to make sense of the world, and what we have to do is obviously flip this around and upgrade human capacity. So how do we fix that? What do? Do we turn off notifications and turn our phones off, grow grayscale? That would be like being in a burning building of climate change and saying, let's ban straws. It's just ridiculous. We need to actually deal with the business model of capturing human attention, paired with the biggest market values in history. That's what we have to decouple. Just really quickly on how we do that as an organization, we focus on how do we change how technology is built. To do that, we change the conditions with external pressure, internal pressure, and aspirational pressure. And to do that, we have to ask transformative, not lightweight questions like removing likes from Instagram, but ask transformative questions about how technology should be designed. So that was a quick overview of, I think, some of the core issues.
So let's get specific about what that means. As a journalist, I'm arguably an attention capitalist. But I presume that you don't think the biggest problem in the world is like digital media, right? You outlined a lot of problems right there. Do you want to talk about like how you think we should triage like those many harms that you identified? And maybe if you're sitting in this audience and you want a place to dive in, where might that be?
Well, the reason we go, one of my mentors is this guy, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and he talks often about needing to find the generator function of the problem, right? Because otherwise you're playing whack-a-mole. So if you say like, oh, climate change, and you have some people freaking out about the loss of bees, some people freaking out about the Amazon, other people about coral reefs. And if you try to solve those problems, each one is it's infinitely complex, and you're trying to play whack-a-mole. You're trying to save this coral reef, and meanwhile the whales die and the pollinators die. So same thing with this. If you try to deal with fake news and your Facebook, and you hire 35,000 content moderators, when you have 2.7 billion people, that's just not the right way to think about it. The fundamental problem, the generator function for all of these harms, was technology getting better and better at hacking human weaknesses. And if you ask, why in the world would technology want to become a magician that's hacking your cognitive elements, your social validation, your confirmation bias, et cetera? And the answer is because of the business model of more changes in your behavior and attention equals more money for me. And so long as those things are coupled, then we have a problem. The thing that makes it unique from news and media, even though that has the same dynamic, is the real-time look at your behavior. So the fact that you're scrolling your news feed and you think you're just innocuously scrolling whatever your friends have to say, but what's really going on is that as you're scrolling, Facebook has woken up a little avatar voodoo doll of Casey. And they split test 100,000 things to show you next when you do this with your finger. It actually simulates all those different possibilities. And so it's playing out all these simulations on you, and your voodoo doll looks and acts more like you based on the clicks that you make, like put the little jacket on the voodoo doll, and the likes you make, put the hair on the voodoo doll. So it looks more like you. And
it looks great, by the way.
It looks pretty great, but the problem is the asymmetry. And so that's what's different from, say, you building a newsletter, and you charge money for your newsletter?
No, it's absolutely free, folks. TheVerge.com/interface.
Okay. Well, it's interesting when you think about, I'm curious with your incentives, but when we're not paying for the product, then we are the product. And I think that's always been true in certain forms of media with advertising, but with technology where that asymmetry has totally taken over, we're not really in control of world history anymore. The technology companies that are shaping our information sense-making environment are in control of every major electoral outcome, whether people believe conspiracy theories, things like that.
So clearly we need a counterweight to this technology, which is now incredibly powerful, as you say. I think the natural place where a lot of us turn is to regulation of some form. And I know you have met with policymakers over the past several years. What is your sense of where they're at, and to what extent do you trust them to craft regulation that can handle these issues with the nuance that they require?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to regulating the design of the platforms, that's obviously where you don't want, some senator in DC who's never been inside of a product design room saying, this is how we should design the color of that button, or whether infinite scroll or not. Although Senator Josh Hawley did introduce a bill that famously went after autoplay, and that's kind of an issue.
Yeah.
You want technologists and designers to be asking these questions, but you want them to be asking those questions in service of the public interest. And so the question is, what would liberate a technologist to ask that question, to ask what's best for people? What's best for, the last speaker talking about children. You have YouTube for Kids jacking kids in for hours a day. Even if you teach kids to meditate, or you have some great education during the day, they go home to 6 hours of being educated by the YouTube designers manipulating them with recommendation systems. This is a huge problem, and so we have to reintroduce, at the very least, I think, the kind of guardrails that we had in the previous era. I think in the last panel, they just talked about the fact that this meat space world has laws, but if you go up into the virtual mimetic space, we have no laws. And two examples of that are, if you think about equal price campaign advertising, that on television, it should cost the same amount on a Tuesday night for one candidate to run an ad and the other candidate to run an ad. When Facebook gobbles up elections and advertising for elections, it doesn't protect that protection. It doesn't carry it over. It says, screw that, we've got this ad auction system, regulation, there are no regulations, let's just let the machine calculate what to show. Should we calculate what's true, or should we have people reviewing that? No, let's just let people say whatever they want. So they just destroy all of the protections that we had there. Same thing, YouTube for Kids, FCC used to regulate children, what they're able to be exposed to. In fact, my understanding is, at least in earlier laws around children's television, you couldn't put a URL in a TV ad. And if you compare that to YouTube, where you're not, because they don't want to push people to the internet. There should be no link between watching TV and pushing a kid to the internet. Compare that to YouTube, where kids spend hours per day. It's literally pushing URLs at you, including, here's the next video, subscribe to this button, go to this website. So if you think about it, it's like we had laws around Saturday morning cartoons, laws around what we used to show children. When YouTube gobbles up that part of the world, it removes all those protections and laws. So I think there's two kinds of regulation to set the stage that you need. One is looking back at the past and saying, what areas of life or society has technology gobbled up, and we've lost important protections that we had? And then the new kinds of regulation are what new issues are being introduced that we don't have regulation for.
Yeah, so Josh Hawley is a fascinating figure to me. Half his ideas are completely terrible, and then the other half are incredibly progressive, so like I don't know what to make of him. Like banning autoplay video, like maybe a great idea. Another one of his ideas is that we should not allow any content moderation that goes beyond the First Amendment, which would turn every single social platform into a place overrun with Nazis, right? And so Hawley to me is like the perfect emblem of why I both am desperate for regulation and terrified of it, because like no one can seem to talk about any of those issues with any nuance for like longer than 30 seconds at a time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that itself is a product of the attention economy, that because we're only able to say things in short sound bites, people are left to say, it's like in the game theory of the debates for the presidential election, what do you think about the Middle East? Here's 30 seconds. You're actually better off game theoretically to attack your opponent with that 30 seconds than to say anything about the Middle East. It's the same kind of thing. And it's incredibly nuanced. I think when you think about the issue of Hawley and the content moderators, the issue is when you have 2 billion self-automated Truman shows. So each of us are jacked into a different channel of personalizing the information that tends to work with us. And then if you think about the fact that they don't have any way to sort of manage what goes on there, the simplest example of this is, do you all remember Facebook trending topics? So Facebook used to have trending topics, and what happened to it? It's not there anymore. So why did it go away? Well, and actually, you know the report. You probably did the reporting on this originally. Do you want to say what it was?
Yeah, so it was revealed that human beings were picking stories, and they didn't, they sometimes chose not to include, far-right stories, and this was interpreted as a giant international scandal, and Facebook freaked out and thought that conservatives would abandon the platform, so they just got rid of human moderators entirely, and so then
a wave of calculating what to show people now, just with the algorithm. So they used to have these like 8 or so topics on the right-hand side, the things most people were talking about, just like Twitter, and it turned out that humans were watching. So Facebook, after all this public pressure of, oh my God, they have humans choosing what's good for people, like editors, Facebook said, fine, we'll get rid of the editors, and now they have the machines choosing. And what happens within 24 hours?
It's just overtaken by lies and hoaxes.
Lies and hoaxes take over, which shows basically as soon as you're not having human oversight, the crazy stuff wins.
Right, and also that's more politically palatable. Like when the algorithm chooses a lie, we can throw our hands up and say, it's computers, what are you going to do, right?
Right.
But it's, we didn't include a Breitbart link. It's like, that's the scandal.
So we have this really tough problem, like the walls are closing in from both sides, like in Star Wars, where you have essentially, Facebook has to both fire the humans that could discern what's good, some kind of notion of what's good, and that's the most politically safe thing for them to do, because anything other than that is involves all this scrutiny. But the problem is, as soon as they do that, lies and hoaxes win and destroys the information ecology, and now we're all consuming nonsense, and that's what you're jacking into 2 billion people's minds. But what Facebook ultimately did is they took down trending topics.
Yeah, we should say they have a new news tab. They've hired human editors. Like, I think that they have learned that particular lesson.
Right. So now you bring that back into advertising.
Yeah.
And this issue of micro-targeting, and Jack Dorsey banning political advertising.
On Twitter.
On Twitter, which in his note he said, because this is an unmanageable thing, like we literally don't know how to solve this problem, because you can have machines split testing on people's avatar voodoo dolls the perfect political message to resonate with their nervous system. So I can play the minor fourth and the major sixth on your outrage, and that works on the piano key of your nervous system. And I can split test that, know what works on every single human being, and that's just this asymmetric narrative warfare thing and Jack knows that he can't solve that in an automated context. So he says, we have to turn this off. And then you look at Facebook's own standard with trending topics and saying, we know we can't prevent trending topics from going crazy and outrageous, so we have to turn this off. Except what are they doing? They still have political advertising. I think you've already heard here today from Marissa Mayer and the CEO of LinkedIn saying we should ban political advertising. We definitely need to have a conversation and ban at least micro-targeting, if not political advertising, in this country.
Which seems like the sort of regulation that you could pass that would not require that much nuance. Whether there's political support for it, I don't know.
Well, I think one side currently is winning by there not being regulations on it.
That's the problem, right? It's like whatever broken system you live in, like, half of the country is maybe benefiting from it. Okay, so I'm coming out of this maybe not super optimistic that we're going to see meaningful regulation in the short term that is going to address the concerns that you raised. In your presentation, and I've heard you use this analogy before, you liken some of these problems to climate change, right? It's like a collective action problem. With climate change, there are things that I can do to make the world better. I can eat less meat. I can take fewer flights. What are the analogs in this attention crisis?
We always struggle with this because it really is a systems problem, and there's different things. So with the election, frankly, I don't know what degree of changes that, given the best case scenario of the engineering capacity of Facebook and Twitter, that they can actually do right now.
Yeah.
And I think you should really take this to heart. Like, Facebook and Twitter don't have this magic button they can push called solving the whole problem and it all goes away, right? They can't just suddenly change the way that people are sharing articles to each other, the fact that our confirmation bias just happens to work. So I think what we really need is something like a public awareness campaign for the election. Something like in 1947, the US used to run domestic propaganda to its own citizens called "Don't Be a Sucker." I don't know if you ever saw these videos. They were grayscale videos from, of course, everything was black and white back then. And it was a video of a guy getting up on a soapbox and shouting fascist propaganda. And then you see an American citizen like listening, kind of, nodding his head, and someone puts his hand on his shoulder and says, "Son, that's fascism, and this is how to spot it. Don't be a sucker." And we need that kind of thing for essentially the ways in which our sense-making is constantly being polluted.
By the way, that campaign never should have ended. Like, that should have just been a continuous 80-year-long campaign.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we had at the time, there was a group called, and I've talked about this many times, but the Committee for National Morale and the Institute for Propaganda Analysis that used to do this kind of, this was back in the 1940s. They were concerned actually about how does the government ethically propagandize an egalitarian democratic way to its own citizens, to sort of say we should have certain egalitarian values, and how do we kind of propagate and instill those values without being authoritarian and fall into the trap of who we're fighting against. But we've lost that, and I think that unless people really realize the extent to which we've been pulled artificially in these different universes, it kind of feels like, I've studied hypnosis in the past, and it feels like we've been manipulated into this multi-year-long hypnotic trance where we've been so gotten used to these different information environments, these different narrative universes, that we need someone to snap their fingers and wake all of us up out of this and saying none of this was a sort of good sense-making environment. We were drinking from the Flint water supply of information.
Yeah. And this is a completely self-serving point, but I sort of want to return to this idea of like, what can the average person do, right? Like, I don't know, just as like a news consumer, I'm just so tired of the amount of problems that seem completely intractable, like that I just sort of have to endure. When it comes to the question of, what can I do about my own attention and the information environment that I live in, something that occurs to me is like, subscribe to a high quality news source, right?
Yeah,
Like, pay someone money for news that you trust.
Yeah, I was going to say, anytime you are interacting with someone whose business model is chasing your attention, you can always guarantee that, unfortunately, the bias will be built into the way that they're communicating to get you into a limbic hijack type, pulling you in over and over again kind of situation. So if you just simply said, I'm only going to look at, even if you think about the public health sort of side of it, that it's more healthy to look not at a moment-by-moment refreshing Twitter, but sort of a weekly review of these are the most important things I really need to know, and not actually having this kind of moment-to-moment stuff, we're really just losing, But we've turned news into a hot take situation. I mentioned this phrase attention capitalism in the slide deck, and it's because that the real trend line has been we've found cheaper and cheaper ways of generating and producing human attention. So if you think about it, used to cost, a lot of money to pay those guys at the New York Times and to pay for security details and to pay for them to go over to the Middle East and have these 12-month-long investigative stories and research all this stuff, and we get it wrong 7 times before we get it right, and we have to double confirm sources. There's this huge amount of labor that went into producing this exact amount of human attention, which is monetized for this certain amount. But then instead of that, what if Facebook or Instagram can convince 1 million teenagers to be obsessed with getting attention from other people, generate their own Instagram accounts, and they'll actually do all that content generation work for free. So they're not like those expensive New York Times guys. So we can actually hollow out the media industry, hollow out the fact checkers, erode the line between sponsored content and written content, and we can have cheap ways of generating human attention. So in general, what I'm trying to get at is the quality of our sense-making has gone down in a really subtle way through everything, because we're getting more and more of information from hot takes, decentralized sources, faster decision-making, erosion of the line between church and state, between editorial and business, because there's nothing guaranteeing that for, say, Instagram publishers.
Yeah. Do you have a view on the value of an individual opting not to participate in one or any of the big social networks? Like, is that a valuable thing either for the individual or the collective?
To opt out of?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously in the long run, we need to migrate to something that's healthier. I'm inspired recently, although I don't know much about it, but Jimmy Wales stepping in with this theoretically a Wikipedia nonprofit version of a social network.
Have you guys seen this? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah, so I mean, WT Social, I think that we have to be really careful, because just because you change the business model doesn't mean you stop making any of the same mistakes. In fact, you're most likely to make all the same mistakes. So it's going to take a hell of a lot of work to do it really differently. But that's inspiring. Talk about regulation again. Senator Mark Warner has, I think it's called the Access Act. That's the Interoperability Act. So the idea that with your phone number, you should be able to take your phone number and without changing your phone number, move from Verizon to AT&T, and there's a standard for that. So we let you interoperate. Same thing with banks. You fill out one form and you can just move all your accounts to a different provider. Why is it that if Jimmy Wales is successful, builds a thing, we can't just instantly one-click migrate to a different, better provider? And Senator Mark Warner's Access bill is something that's getting at that, and it was inspired in part by AOL. The AOL Instant Messenger used to have a kind of a monopoly on instant messaging, and it was during AOL's monopoly. And as I understand it, during the antitrust investigation and some regulations that were passed, they forced AOL Instant Messenger to be interoperable. So that meant that you could have a Jabber client or iChat or any old independent client connect into AOL, and you could still connect to the network.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing that loosens that monopoly grip, it's actually potentially faster than getting a full antitrust breakup of the companies, but instead creating the interoperability now so that these kinds of alternatives can be experimented with.
Yeah. So you had this incredible success last year where after writing and talking about the idea of time well spent, Apple and Google in this incredibly short period implemented screen time controls and sort of took a step down that path. It strikes me that what you want them to do is much more difficult. And so I just wonder, how have your conversations with those folks, either at sort of the high level or the rank and file, changed over the last year as you've started to talk about wanting to see them make more radical changes?
It's a great question. I mean, I think the thing that's most inspiring to me is the Facebook employee letter. I don't know how many of you saw this, but the fact that Facebook's own employees wrote a letter to Mark Zuckerberg with the line, "This is still our company," really powerful rhetoric, and actually saying we need to do this differently. That had never happened before. We've been trying to wake up people, in the industry for a long time. As I mentioned in our theory of change, inside pressure from inside employees is the fastest way to create change, much faster than regulation, because if you have an HR crisis and it's way more expensive to replace those employees, that's the fastest way. So that has been really inspiring to me, that there's some changes happening there. Jack Dorsey, top down, saying, all out, we're going to ban political advertising, and that moving the Overton window is really inspiring. Yes, it's true that the changes that we're advocating for are much deeper and much more structural. And the best thing would be for Apple to take a huge leap forward from just showing you a chart and graph of where your screen time is to completely reorienting the incentives away from attention. This would be like changing the App Store into like a help center where I'm not getting apps, I'm getting things that help me with different parts of life to make sure that life looks like how we want it to look, meaning that our choices end up lining up with our values. And that could be things like deeply integrated into the calendar, changing the orientation of app stores so it's not about the most grossing or most downloaded, but instead the things that help people with the most with these kinds of values or these kinds of values. And that's a very deep structural change, but that's the kind of thing that only Apple can do. They're kind of like the central bank or the Federal Reserve of the attention economy.
Well, I think it's about time to take some questions from the crowd. Folks have questions? See one right here.
So thank you. I paid a lot of attention. Can you talk a little bit about the best tools for self-manipulation? You know, things like analyzing how much you use stuff, how long-term you think, just all the stuff that they use against us if we use it on ourselves.
You mean like what? Like when they use what
Well,
against
you know,
us?
maybe there's this really famous guy. It would be nice for him to know exactly how often he tweets and how much more he misspells things when it's 2 a.m. in the morning versus, you know, just a little more self-analysis that gives you some outside perspective on your own behavior.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
What do you know and what would you design if you had the time?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's a great prompt. I mean, I think if you just think to yourself in that specific notion that you just laid out, how do you feel when you're using Twitter at 11:30 p.m.? Not very good. How do you behave? What do you ever respond outrageously or feel bad or do something you wish you didn't do? Now imagine the president in that state. These design tricks of persuasive technology work on everyone. And I think that's what it's really weird about this is we're talking about at the Paleolithic level these features of ourselves that, you know, outrage has this effect on us, that confirmation, it feels good to get affirmation of our beliefs, it feels bad to get information that goes against our beliefs. When you realize that that's true of every human being on the planet, it calls for a kind of we're all in the same boat together. I don't know what those tools would look like, but I think that it's a good project for at least in Twitter, you could do that since there's open APIs. It's hard to do that with things like Facebook because they're closing down certain aspects.
Maybe take one more. Oh, that's great. Sure.
Tristan, huge fan of yours, first of all. Thank you so much for all of the dialogue that you've encouraged. I know a lot of people have been affected by it, so thank you. My name is Lakshmi. I was at WeWork as of 3 weeks ago. I'm no longer there. But before that, I worked in the dating category for about 7 years. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. So before that, I worked in the dating category for about 7 years, really trying to make it a more humane process. And it's funny, when you bring up the topic of dating, people tend to kind of back away. There's a lot of like shame and vulnerability associated with it, but it's a really big part of our lives. And I actually think it impacts way more than we're willing to talk about. And we've accepted all of these tools into the dating world that many of them were devised by fraternity brothers when they were in their 20s, and they have set the standard for how we're connecting and meeting people when it comes to dating. So I had a couple of questions. One, is your Center for Humane Technology looking at this area at all and developing a point of view? And if not, can you and I talk?
Thank you. Yeah. We just gave a presentation this past Thursday, this event called What's Now, and we laid out if we're going to change how we design these products. I don't think one thing that's really difficult for an industry is we've defined many of the problems. We don't have an aspirational vision of how this looks if we get it right. Right now, it just feels like everywhere we go, it looks wrong, and it's bad. And I think with dating, one of the examples that I gave in the presentation was instead of trying to disrupt everything and try to engineer a tech solution, I think the new version of humane technology is identifying what already works great in human relating and how to wrap around and instrument and strengthen those mycelium pathways, almost like permaculture for the social fabric. So you're really thinking about like gardening the existing things that work in your human social fabric garden. So that's like, you know, if 40 single people gather for a weekend in a cabin for 3 or 4 days, like we have all this great chemistry between ourselves that makes that work really seamlessly, dancing, salsa dancing, things like this. And I think that technology is trying to recreate that process from scratch instead of actually trying to wrap around and strengthen the existing ways that it works great. And the weird thing is we've lost track of the ways that it works great because we've been through a multi-generational decay of the cultural fabric institutions that tend to promote the things that work anyway. So I'd love to talk to you more about that if you want to find us afterwards.
Okay, I'm up here both to stop the session, but also to ask a question of both of you. One of the things that really has struck me, and you know, I think about this quite a bit, the inability or unwillingness of the platforms to engage in any kind of public dialogue about these questions at all, except when called to Congress, or for God's sake. I mean, you two, me and Konstantinos, we should be talking to them publicly, and they should be bearing responsibilities for their public statements when asked real questions in public.
Yeah.
But Zuckerberg, I don't think he's really taken real questions in public since 2 years ago when he put his foot in his mouth on this very stage. So how do you guys feel? Is that something you would like to see? Do you think there's any hope of it?
I mean, for me, this feels a little bit like debate me, you coward, right? Which I'm not sure how helpful it would be, because I can't name an issue where I don't know Facebook's opinion about it, right? Like, they're not secretive in their beliefs. You could argue that they actually talk a ton. I mean, Zuckerberg was on a press call with reporters last week. I mean, I've asked a couple of questions in the past year on subjects just like that. So, like, I actually would almost remove Facebook's viewpoints from the conversation, because we know what they are, and it's always going to be an answer that serves the ideology. Like, what I find is that they experience pressure from folks like Tristan and others, and then they move in a direction. And so, to me, what's more interesting is to watch that movement, as opposed to
That's a very good answer, and not one that I would have given, obviously.
I'll just say one
what do you have any different view?
I mean, I think they definitely should come to bear, but I think what Casey just said is, I often use this metaphor of listening to tech leadership is sometimes like watching a hostage in a hostage video. Like, they're saying this kind of gibberish, and you're like, why are they talking in this bizarre way that doesn't make any sense? Until you see off stage of someone holding a gun to their head, that's their business model, and you realize, oh, that's why they're not making any sense. And that's the truth. Like, they're saying this bullshit, frankly, that I don't blame them as people. I think the leadership are trapped. So instead of seeing them as evil or bad, I think they're trapped. And we need to help them, but to have an honest conversation about how to help them, we have to be in that kind of dialogue.
Yeah, I do think a public, some kind of, there's so many players in the ecosystem of the planet that are implicated in this, that even though they do talk to reporters, they've got to come out of their shell. That's my opinion. And I hope, I don't know if that's going to happen, but there's so many issues, and I love your video. That was the best distilled version of your message I've seen yet, so thank you both so much.
Thanks a lot.